In the hidden shadows of Liberty Park, a man who's all but invisible to society makes a life-changing choice. Xavier, a homeless soul carrying the weight of a troubled past, witnesses a young girl, Lily, surrounded by a group of bullies. Reluctantly, he steps in, unable to stand by and watch history repeat itself. Little does he know, this single act of courage will throw him into a world he never imagined, one filled with wealth, power, and hidden connections. When Lily's father, a wealthy businessman named Julian Whitmore, arrives, he mistakes Xavier for a threat, and the tension is electric. Julian's skepticism challenges Xavier's new path, and the clash between them only deepens as unexpected bonds start to form. But just as hope begins to flicker, shadows from Xavier's past resurface, threatening to tear down everything he's built. Will Xavier find redemption and a family in the most unlikely place? Or will his past destroy his second chance before it truly begins? Malik shifted on the cold, unforgiving bench, the early morning sun filtering through the skeletal branches of Liberty Park's barren trees. He tugged his coat tighter, attempting to trap any lingering warmth against his body, and his eyes scanned the empty park out of habit. The world around him was quiet, devoid of anything more than the rustle of the wind and the distant murmur of the city beyond the park's borders. For a moment, the day seemed like any other, uneventful, predictable, and numbing in its monotony. And then a sharp cry cut through the air. The sound jolted Malik upright, his body stiffening as he tried to locate the source. His heart thudded in his chest as his eyes locked onto a scene across the park. A young girl, no older than 10, was surrounded by a group of boys. They were rough, their voices filled with mocking laughter as they closed in on her, pushing her back and forth like she was nothing more than a rag doll. The girl's cry echoed in Malik's ears, each desperate note pulling at something deep inside him, something that he'd long tried to bury. Memories surged back, unbidden. He saw flashes of himself, small, scared, with no one to protect him. He remembered the bullies, their sneering faces, the way he felt so powerless. He'd been alone then, and no one had stepped in to help. Malik's fingers tightened on the edge of the bench. He could feel the conflict rise inside him, the urge to help, to stand up, clashing violently with the fear that had gripped him his whole life. He had tried to intervene once before, a long time ago, and the consequences had scarred him, leaving him with nothing but regrets and caution. He didn't want to make the same mistake, not again. But the girl's eyes, terrified and full of tears, met his across the distance. And in that moment, Malik knew he couldn't stay still. His body moved before his mind had fully caught up, his legs pushing him off the bench and across the park. His breath quickened, and he could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as he approached the group. The boys had their backs to him, too preoccupied with tormenting the girl to notice his approach. "Hey!" Malik shouted, his voice louder and firmer than he thought possible. "Get away from her!" The boys stopped, turning toward him. The leader, a tall boy with a buzz cut and a sneer plastered across his face, stared at Malik with a mix of surprise and annoyance. He stepped forward, his posture radiating arrogance. As he sized Malik up, clearly unimpressed by the sight of a disheveled homeless man. "Who do you think you are, old man?" The boy, Ryan, taunted, his friends snickering behind him. He took another step forward, his hand dropping to his waist where Malik could barely make out the outline of something, maybe a knife. Malik felt his heart stutter, fear clawing at his insides. He was unarmed, vulnerable, and these boys had youth and numbers on their side. But he refused to back down. Not now, not with that girl watching him with wide, pleading eyes. He took a deep breath, straightening his back, his gaze locking onto Ryan's. "I'm someone who's not going to let you hurt her," Malik said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. He could see the uncertainty flicker in Ryan's eyes, just for a moment. Ryan hesitated, glancing back at his friends, and Malik knew that this was it, his chance to stand his ground, to make a difference. Just then, a new voice rang out, cutting through the tension. "Hey, what's going on here?" An elderly man, Harold, had stopped near the edge of the scene, his phone held up in one hand, clearly ready to call for help. His voice carried an authority that made Ryan flinch, his bravado crumbling as he realized the situation was no longer in his control. "Let's get out of here," Ryan muttered to his friends, scowling at Malik before turning away. "This isn't worth it." The boys backed off, their footsteps fading into the distance as they left the park, muttering insults under their breath. Malik watched them go, his shoulders sagging with relief as the adrenaline began to ebb. Slowly, he turned his attention back to the girl. She was sitting on the ground, her small frame trembling with silent sobs, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. Malik knelt down beside her, his voice softening as he spoke. "Hey, it's okay now," he said, his eyes gentle as he tried to catch her gaze. "They're gone. You're safe." The girl looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with both fear and confusion. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Malik gave her a small, reassuring smile. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice calm, trying to soothe her frazzled nerves. "Casey," she said, sniffling, her eyes darting nervously around as if to make sure the bullies were really gone. "Well, Casey, I'm Malik. I promise you, you're safe now," Malik said, his heart softening at the sight of her vulnerability. He could see so much of himself in her, the fear, the helplessness. He reached out, offering his hand to help her up. She hesitated for a moment before taking it, her small fingers curling around his. Once she was standing, Malik glanced around, realizing the park was still mostly empty. "Are your parents nearby?" he asked. Casey shook her head. "My dad, he's coming soon. He told me to wait here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Malik frowned, worry tugging at him. He didn't want to leave her alone, not after what had just happened. "How about I stay with you until he gets here?" he suggested. Casey looked at him for a long moment before nodding, her eyes filled with a cautious kind of trust. Malik led her to a nearby bench, sitting down beside her, his eyes scanning the park for any sign of danger. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the tension slowly ebbing as the immediate threat faded into memory. After a while, Casey spoke, her voice small and uncertain. Have you always been here? In the park?" Malik hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, for a while now," he admitted. He didn't go into details. He didn't want to scare her. And besides, she didn't need to hear the ugly parts of his life. "Why?" Casey asked, her innocent curiosity cutting through Malik's defenses. He sighed, looking down at his hands. "Life doesn't always go the way we want it to," he said quietly. "Sometimes things happen, and you end up somewhere you never thought you'd be." He glanced at her, giving her a small, sad smile. "But you always have to keep going, you know? Even when it's hard." Casey nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "Thank you for helping me," she said again, her voice stronger this time. Malik felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. "Anytime, kid," he said, his voice filled with a sincerity that surprised even him. Just then, the sound of an engine caught their attention. A sleek black SUV pulled up at the edge of the park, and Casey's face lit up. "That's my dad," she said, her voice filled with relief. Malik watched as a tall, well-dressed man stepped out of the car, his eyes immediately locking onto Casey. He rushed over, pulling her into a tight embrace, his eyes filled with worry. "Casey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "I'm okay, Dad," Casey said, pulling back slightly to look at Malik. "He helped me." The man's eyes shifted to Malik, his expression hardening. He looked Malik up and down, his gaze filled with suspicion. Malik could see the judgment in his eyes, the way he assessed Malik's worn clothes, his unshaven face. For a moment, Malik felt the familiar sting of rejection, the reminder that people like him were always looked at with distrust. But then Casey spoke again, her voice filled with a kind of fierce loyalty that took Malik by surprise. "Dad, he saved me," she said, her small hand gripping her father's sleeve. "He's a good man." The man's gaze softened slightly, and he gave Malik a nod, though his unease was still evident. "Thank you," he said, his voice clipped but genuine. Malik shrugged, trying to play it off. Just did what anyone would do, he said. Casey looked up at her father, her eyes wide. Can he wait with us until we leave? She asked, her voice hopeful. Her father hesitated, his protective instincts clearly warring with his daughter's request. Finally, he nodded, though his body remained tense. Okay, he said, but we're leaving soon. Malik smiled at Casey, then sat back down on the bench, the sense of purpose from earlier still warming his chest. He didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he mattered. And that, he thought, was more than enough. The park had returned to its quiet state with only a few distant voices and the occasional bark of a dog breaking the silence. Malik sat on the bench next to Casey and her father, Vincent, the tension palpable. Vincent, clearly still assessing the situation, kept glancing over at Malik with a guarded expression, his posture tense as though ready to spring into action should anything seem amiss. Malik could tell Vincent didn't trust him. Who would trust a scruffy man like him? But Malik had no intentions beyond making sure Casey was safe, and he wasn't about to let anyone's judgment affect him right now, especially not after what just happened. Vincent's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He pulled it from his pocket, his expression souring as he checked the screen. Malik could hear a voice coming from the other end, faint but urgent, pulling Vincent's attention away from them. He turned slightly, speaking in a low voice, obviously trying to manage a problem that couldn't wait. As Vincent's back was momentarily turned, Casey leaned closer to Malik. "Do you have anywhere to go?" she asked in a soft voice, almost a whisper, her wide eyes filled with genuine concern. Malik blinked, a little taken aback by her question. He hesitated before answering. I manage," he said, his voice barely audible, not wanting Vincent to overhear. He didn't want her pity. He was used to living without much. What hurt more than the hunger or the cold was the judgment, the looks he'd get, just like the one Vincent was giving him now. Casey, sensing Malik's hesitation, nodded, her small face looking far too mature for her age. "You deserve somewhere nice," she said, sincerity shining through her words. Malik gave her a soft smile. "That's kind of you, kiddo. But don't worry about me, okay?" He patted her shoulder lightly, trying to brush away the subject. The truth was, people like Malik didn't get to have somewhere nice, and he was used to it by now. Vincent turned back around, his conversation apparently finished. He tucked the phone back into his pocket and took a deep breath, regarding Malik with the same guarded suspicion. Vincent's posture was stiff, and he kept an arm protectively wrapped around Casey, even though the danger had long since passed. "Look," Vincent started, his voice low, his eyes still assessing Malik. "I appreciate what you did for my daughter, but you understand, I've got to be careful." Malik nodded, unsurprised. "I get it," he replied simply. He didn't expect anything from Vincent. He was here for Casey, not for any kind of reward or thanks. Vincent's eyes flickered, a moment of hesitation passing across his face. He glanced down at Casey, who was still holding onto his sleeve. There was something almost pleading in her eyes, and Vincent sighed, seemingly relenting. "Can I give you a ride somewhere?" Vincent finally asked, the offer sounding strained, like it cost him something to say it. "Anywhere you need to go?" Malik was surprised by the offer. He hesitated, unsure. He didn't want to impose. But the day had taken a toll on him, and the thought of walking back to the alley he'd been sleeping in seemed more daunting than usual. And deep down, he was curious about these people. Curious why Casey cared so much and why Vincent seemed torn between prejudice and gratitude. Malik nodded slowly. "Sure," he said. "There's a shelter a few blocks from here. You could drop me there." Vincent seemed to relax slightly at the response. He looked down at Casey, giving her a small smile. "All right, let's go then." He stood, keeping a hand on Casey's shoulder as they walked towards the SUV. Malik followed a few steps behind, still feeling like an outsider. He didn't want to make them uncomfortable, but Casey kept glancing back at him, smiling in a way that made him feel like he belonged, even if just for a moment. It was a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. They reached the SUV, and Vincent opened the back door for Casey, who climbed in with a bounce. Vincent gestured to Malik to get in the front seat, his eyes still cautious, but less hardened now. Malik hesitated for a second before opening the door and sliding into the passenger seat, the leather cool beneath him. The car ride was quiet at first, the silence awkward and thick. Malik glanced out of the window, watching the streets blur by. He didn't know what to say, and Vincent didn't seem eager to fill the silence. Casey, however, was less inclined to let the quiet linger. "Daddy," she piped up from the back seat, her voice breaking the tension. "Did you know Malik used to live somewhere really nice?" Malik shot a glance back at Casey, a little startled by her sudden declaration. Vincent's eyes flicked towards Malik, a question evident in his gaze. Malik cleared his throat, giving a small, humorless chuckle. "Yeah, well, that was a long time ago," he said, trying to downplay it. He didn't want to get into the details. Not here, not now. The past was painful enough, without having to relive it in front of strangers. Vincent's eyes narrowed slightly. His curiosity piqued despite himself. "What happened?" he asked, his voice more gentle this time, though Malik could still hear the guarded edge. Malik hesitated, his eyes shifting back to the window. He wasn't used to sharing, not anymore, but Casey was looking at him with such earnest curiosity, and Vincent's eyes had lost some of their suspicion, replaced by something else, something almost like understanding. "I had a job, a house, a life," Malik said, his voice quiet, almost lost under the hum of the engine. "But life, it doesn't always go how you expect. I lost my job, lost everything, and here I am." He tried to keep his tone light, as if it didn't matter. But the truth was, it did. It mattered more than he liked to admit. Vincent didn't say anything for a moment. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Finally he nodded, his gaze shifting back to the road. "I understand," he said, his voice low. "Life can be unpredictable." Malik looked over at Vincent, surprised by the note of empathy in his voice. He hadn't expected that. Maybe there was more to this man than he'd thought. "Daddy, can we help Malik?" Casey asked suddenly, her voice filled with a child's simple sense of right and wrong, her concern for Malik unwavering. Vincent let out a slow breath, clearly caught off guard by his daughter's question. He glanced at Malik, then back at Casey through the rearview mirror. "We'll see, sweetheart," he said, finally, his voice softening. "We'll see what we can do." The rest of the drive was quiet, but the tension had shifted. There was something almost hopeful in the air, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Malik wasn't sure what to make of it, but for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. They pulled up to the shelter, a nondescript brick building with a faded sign above the door. Malik opened the car door, pausing for a moment before stepping out. He turned back to Vincent and Casey, giving them a small smile. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his voice sincere. Vincent nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Take care of yourself, Malik," he said. Casey leaned forward, her small face bright with a smile. "We'll see you again, right?" Malik's heart twisted at her words, the innocence and hope in her voice almost too much for him. He nodded, his throat feeling tight. "Yeah, kiddo. Maybe you will." He closed the door, stepping away from the car, and watched as they drove off, the tail lights disappearing around the corner. Malik stood there for a moment, the night air cold against his skin. He turned towards the shelter, the warmth of the place welcoming, but his mind lingered on the girl and her father, the way they had looked at him, the way they had treated him, not as some faceless nobody, but as a person. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for someone like him after all. The soft glow of morning settled over the park, painting everything in gentle hues of orange and gold. The sun peeked over the rooftops, slowly warming the chill in the air, and the streets were just beginning to fill with early commuters, the city waking up to a new day. Malik sat quietly on the bench, his body weary but his mind restless. Last night had left him with a strange feeling. Hope, perhaps, but something else as well, something heavier. He wasn't sure why the encounter with Vincent and Casey lingered in his thoughts the way it did. He'd helped people before, intervened in fights, assisted strangers on the street. It was part of what made him who he was, despite the cards life had dealt him. But this time, it felt different. The warmth of Casey's innocent concern, the wary gratitude in Vincent's eyes, they both had left an imprint that he couldn't shake. As he sat lost in thought, the unmistakable sound of tires on gravel reached his ears. He looked up, squinting against the morning sun. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw the familiar black SUV rolling to a stop not far from where he sat. He frowned, standing up from the bench, unsure if he was seeing things. The passenger door swung open, and out stepped Vincent, dressed sharply in a suit that seemed to speak volumes about his life. Polished, put together, successful. He walked briskly toward Malik, his face set in an unreadable expression. Before Malik could react, the back door opened, and Casey jumped out, her face lighting up with excitement as soon as she spotted him. "Malik!" she called out, running towards him, her little legs barely keeping up with her enthusiasm. She came to a skidding stop just in front of him, her bright eyes looking up at his. "Hey, kiddo," Malik said, his voice softer than usual, a smile tugging at his lips. "What are you doing here?" Vincent approached, his hands tucked into his pockets, his expression guarded as always. Malik straightened, unsure what to make of Vincent's sudden appearance, or the reason for their visit. "Morning," Vincent said curtly, nodding slightly as he reached them. He paused, glancing down at Casey, then back at Malik. There was a hint of discomfort in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely sure what to say or how to start this conversation. Casey saved him the trouble. "Daddy wanted to come and see you," she said, her voice full of certainty, as if there was no other reason they'd be here so early. "We thought maybe we could bring you breakfast." She looked back at Vincent, her face glowing with anticipation. Vincent let out a breath, clearly unprepared for the sheer honesty in his daughter's words. He turned his gaze back to Malik, giving a small, reluctant smile. "She insisted," he said, his tone attempting nonchalance. Malik glanced between the two, still feeling a sense of disbelief. He hadn't expected to see them again, and certainly not like this. The vulnerability of seeing them come back, bringing him a simple gesture of kindness, was almost overwhelming. "Well, thank you," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "You really didn't need to." He could hardly remember the last time someone had gone out of their way just for him. Vincent shrugged, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there the previous night. He motioned towards the SUV. "We brought something to eat," he said, nodding toward the back of the vehicle where a small bag sat on the seat. "I thought, maybe we could talk a bit more." Malik felt a knot form in his throat, a mix of gratitude and confusion washing over him. He wasn't used to people wanting to talk to him, much less someone like Vincent, a man who clearly had everything going for him, whose life seemed to be on a completely different track than Malik's had ever been. "Sure," Malik said after a beat, nodding. "I'd like that." The three of them made their way to a picnic table a few yards away, the metal surface cool under the morning sun. Casey pulled herself up onto the bench next to Malik, her feet dangling as she rocked back and forth, while Vincent settled across from them, placing the breakfast bag between them. Vincent pulled out a couple of wrapped sandwiches and some juice boxes, setting them out without a word. The moment felt oddly intimate, like a family picnic almost, which made something inside Malik ache with a longing he'd long since tried to bury. "Here," Vincent said, passing one of the sandwiches to Malik. Malik took it, hesitating for a second before unwrapping it. The smell of bacon and eggs wafted up, making his stomach growl in response. He hadn't realized just how hungry he was. "Thanks," Malik said, his voice genuine. He took a bite, the warmth of the food spreading through him, filling a hole he hadn't realized was so empty. He glanced at Casey, who was busy tearing into her sandwich, her enthusiasm infectious. Vincent cleared his throat, drawing Malik's attention back to him. He looked at Malik for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Look, I didn't mean to misjudge you," Vincent said finally, his voice softer than before. "Last night, I didn't know what was going on, and I jumped to conclusions." Malik nodded, swallowing the bite in his mouth. "I understand," he said simply. "You were protecting your daughter." Anyone would have done the same. He didn't blame Vincent for the suspicion. It was a natural reaction, and one Malik was used to. Vincent seemed to relax a bit at Malik's response. He leaned back, his eyes drifting to Casey, who was now busy sipping on her juice box. He let out a slow breath, his gaze returning to Malik. "She hasn't stopped talking about you," Vincent said, his voice carrying a note of amusement. "You made quite the impression." Malik looked at Casey, her bright eyes meeting his, and he couldn't help the smile that spread across his face. "She's a special kid," he said. "You're lucky to have her." Vincent's expression softened at Malik's words. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, a hint of vulnerability slipping through the cracks of his usually guarded demeanor. There was a moment of silence, the three of them sitting there, the warmth of the sun growing stronger as the morning progressed. It was peaceful, the kind of peace Malik had almost forgotten could exist in his life. Vincent shifted, his gaze becoming more serious. "I don't know your story, Malik," he said slowly, "but I do know that what you did last night, not everyone would have done that. You put yourself in harm's way for someone you didn't even know." Malik shrugged, trying to downplay it. "It was the right thing to do," he said simply. Vincent nodded, his eyes never leaving Malik's. "Maybe so, but the right thing isn't always easy. It takes guts." He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. "And I think someone like you deserves a second chance." Malik's breath caught in his throat, the words hanging in the air between them. A second chance. It was something he had stopped believing in long ago. Life had a way of beating that hope out of people like him, people who had lost everything, with no one to turn to, no safety net to catch them when they fell. Vincent reached into his pocket, pulling out a small card and sliding it across the table toward Malik. Malik looked down at it, the name of a construction company printed neatly across the front, along with Vincent's own name and number. "We're always looking for good people," Vincent said, his voice steady, his eyes meeting Malik's. "It's nothing fancy, but it's honest work. If you're interested, give me a call." Malik stared at the card for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. It felt like a lifeline, one he wasn't sure he deserved, but one that was being offered nonetheless. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the edge of the card before picking it up. He looked at Vincent, his throat tight with emotion. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this for me?" Vincent looked at him, his expression earnest. "Because you saved my daughter," he said, simply, "and because everyone deserves a chance to get back on their feet." Malik swallowed, the weight of Vincent's words settling deep within him. He looked down at the card again, the possibilities it represented almost too much to comprehend. He nodded slowly, slipping the card into his pocket. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Casey, her smile bright and unwavering, and he knew that somehow this little girl had given him something he hadn't realized he needed: hope. Vincent stood, brushing off his suit and giving Malik a small nod. "Think about it," he said. "We'll be around." He turned to Casey, holding out his hand. "Come on, sweetheart. Time to go." Casey jumped off the bench, giving Malik one last smile before taking her father's hand. "See you soon, Malik," she called as they walked away, her voice full of innocence and hope. Malik watched them leave, his heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the card, the promise of a new beginning. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Malik allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The air was crisp the next day, as Malik made his way back to the park. Despite everything that had happened, the events of yesterday felt almost unreal. It was as if his world had suddenly shifted, like he was stepping into a new chapter of his life that had been sealed shut for years. He found his usual bench, the one that had become his makeshift home, a place that offered a semblance of stability amid the chaos. Malik sat down, the business card Vincent had given him, still tucked safely in his pocket. He pulled it out, running his fingers over the glossy surface, reading Vincent's name again and again. It felt like an opportunity to step back into society, to be more than just the man on the bench that people passed without a second glance. But it also felt daunting. What if he failed? What if this chance turned out to be another disappointment, another reminder of how far he had fallen? Malik sighed, leaning back, his gaze drifting upward, watching as the leaves rustled softly in the wind. He was lost in thought when a familiar voice snapped him back to reality. "Malik!" He turned just in time to see Casey running toward him, her arms waving as she bounded over with her uncontainable energy. Behind her, Vincent followed at a slower pace, his hands once again in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Malik stood, a smile tugging at his lips as Casey skidded to a halt in front of him. "Hey, kiddo," he greeted her warmly. "Back so soon?" Casey nodded vigorously, her ponytail bouncing with the motion. "We came to see you," she said brightly. "Daddy said we could spend some time with you today." Vincent reached them, his eyes meeting Malik's briefly before he looked at his daughter. "I figured we could grab a coffee or something," he said, his voice careful, as though he was still testing the waters. "If you're free." Malik looked between Vincent and Casey, surprised. He hadn't expected them to return so soon, let alone to want to spend more time with him. Yeah," he said, slipping Vincent's card back into his pocket. "Sure, I'd like that." Vincent nodded, a small smile flickering across his lips. "There's a place not far from here," he said, gesturing toward the street. "They've got great coffee." Malik fell into step beside Vincent, Casey skipping along on his other side. The walk was short, but the silence between Malik and Vincent was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts. Casey, however, filled the air with her chatter, stories from school, her favorite cartoon, the new book she was reading. Malik listened, nodding along, the innocence in her voice warming something deep inside him. When they reached the small cafe, Vincent held the door open for them, gesturing for Malik to enter. Malik hesitated for a split second. He wasn't used to being treated with such respect, but he nodded his thanks and stepped inside. The cafe was cozy, with mismatched chairs and soft music playing in the background. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and Malik couldn't remember the last time he'd stepped into a place like this, a place that felt so normal, so far from the life he'd been living. Vincent ordered for all of them, getting Malik a black coffee and Casey a hot chocolate, then led them to a table near the window. Casey sat next to Malik, her eyes sparkling as she looked out at the people passing by. Malik sipped his coffee, the warmth spreading through him, easing the tension in his shoulders. He glanced at Vincent, who was watching him, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know," Vincent said, breaking the silence, "Casey doesn't usually warm up to strangers like this." He looked at his daughter, then back at Malik. "You must have made quite the impression." Malik shrugged, a shy smile on his face. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "Just tried to help." Vincent nodded, his eyes never leaving Malik's. "Sometimes that's all it takes," he said quietly. "A lot of people wouldn't have stepped in. I know I've been wary, but I'm starting to think that maybe we crossed paths for a reason." Malik raised an eyebrow, surprised by Vincent's honesty. He could see the hesitation in Vincent's eyes, the reluctance to let his guard down, but there was also something else, an openness, a willingness to see Malik as more than just a homeless man. "Maybe," Malik said, his voice soft. He looked down at his coffee, the steam swirling up in delicate spirals. I think I needed to meet you two, too." The words were honest, raw, and Malik wasn't used to opening up like this, especially not to someone like Vincent, a man who seemed to have everything Malik had lost, a life he'd long since given up on. Casey looked up at Malik, her eyes wide. "Do you have a family, Malik?" she asked, her voice innocent, but the question pierced Malik like a knife. Malik paused, the smile fading from his face. He glanced at Vincent, who looked as if he might intervene, but Malik shook his head, giving Casey a small, sad smile. "I did," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A long time ago." He didn't elaborate, and Casey, sensing the sadness in his voice, reached over, her small hand resting on his arm. "It's okay," she said, her voice gentle. "You have us now." Malik felt his throat tighten, the simple innocence of her words touching something deep inside him. He glanced at Vincent, who was watching them, his expression softening. "We all have our pasts," Vincent said quietly, his eyes meeting Malik's. "But that doesn't mean we can't build something new. A new start, a new family, whatever it may be." Malik nodded slowly, the weight of Vincent's words settling into his chest. A new start. It was something he had stopped dreaming about. But now, sitting here, surrounded by warmth and kindness, it didn't seem as impossible as it once had. They finished their drinks, and as they walked back to the park, the tension between Malik and Vincent seemed to ease. It wasn't gone, not completely, but it was softer, replaced by something akin to understanding. When they reached the park, Vincent turned to Malik, a hint of hesitation in his eyes. "About that offer," he said, his voice steady. "The job. I meant it." Malik looked at him, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been thinking about the offer since the moment Vincent had given him the card, the possibilities swirling in his mind. It was terrifying, putting himself out there, risking failure. But it was also a chance, a real chance to change his life. I don't know if I can do it," Malik said honestly, his voice shaking slightly. "I've been out of it for so long. I don't know if I'm capable." Vincent shook his head, his expression firm. "You saved my daughter," he said simply. "You're capable. You just have to believe in yourself. And I'll help you. We'll help you." Casey nodded vigorously, her hand slipping into Malik's. "Yeah, you can do it, Malik. You're the bravest person I know." Malik looked down at her, her eyes full of hope and trust, and he felt something shift inside him. Maybe he wasn't ready. Maybe he would fail. But maybe, just maybe, he could try. And that was enough. He nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll give it a shot." Vincent smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Good," he said. "We'll get you set up. Whatever you need, we'll help." Malik felt a warmth spread through him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun or the coffee. It was the warmth of hope, of connection, of the possibility of something better. They stood there for a moment, the three of them, the park bustling around them, the city waking up to a new day. And for the first time in a long time, Malik felt like he belonged. Like he wasn't just a man on a bench, but a part of something. Something bigger. Something meaningful. "Come on, Casey," Vincent said, his voice soft as he looked at his daughter. "We should get going. Malik has a lot to think about." Casey nodded, giving Malik's hand a final squeeze before letting go. "See you soon, Malik," she said, her voice bright and hopeful. Malik watched them walk away, Vincent's arm around Casey's shoulders, her laughter echoing in the crisp morning air. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the card once more, his fingers running over the name printed on it. A second chance. It was something he had never imagined for himself, something he had long since given up on. But now, standing here, watching Vincent and Casey disappear into the distance, he allowed himself to believe, to hope. Malik slipped the card back into his pocket, a smile spreading across his face as he turned back toward the park. It was time to take that step, to build something new, to build a bridge to a future that was his for the taking. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Malik felt ready. Malik was used to the solitude of the park, the sense of familiarity in watching the same faces pass by, the rhythm of the city blending into a comforting background noise. The bench had become his world, a small, constant reminder of both what he had lost and what he was yet to gain. He thought he'd grown used to being alone, a ghost in a bustling city. But after the events of the past few days, something had changed. It was a Tuesday morning, with the sun breaking through the clouds in hazy beams that warmed his face as he sat on his usual bench. Malik felt lighter, as though the conversation with Vincent and Casey had somehow shaken off the weight of the years of disappointment. The idea of a job, a new beginning, it filled him with nervous energy. He didn't know what would come next, but he was willing to try. He was deep in thought, staring at the birds pecking at breadcrumbs by his feet, when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching, familiar, hurried footsteps. Malik glanced up, his heart skipping a beat as he saw Casey running towards him, her ponytail bouncing, her smile wide. "Malik!" she called, her voice filled with excitement. Malik stood, surprised but happy to see her. "Hey, kiddo," he greeted her, his eyes shifting past her to see Vincent following at a slower pace, as usual. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you today." Casey stopped in front of him, slightly out of breath, her cheeks flushed. She grinned up at him. "Daddy said we could come see you before you went to work," she explained, her enthusiasm bubbling over. "I brought you something." Malik raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "Oh yeah? What's that?" Casey rummaged through her small backpack, pulling out a neatly wrapped sandwich and a juice box. She held them out to him, her eyes shining. "It's peanut butter and jelly. Daddy said it's okay to share." Malik took the sandwich, his throat tightening with unexpected emotion. It wasn't about the sandwich. It was about the gesture, the thought behind it. He looked over at Vincent, who had finally reached them, his expression softer than usual. "Thank you, Casey. This means a lot," Malik said, his voice thick. He cleared his throat, giving Vincent a nod. "And thank you, too." Vincent shrugged, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "She insisted," he said, his tone casual, but there was warmth in his eyes. "Figured you could use a good breakfast." They sat together on the bench, Casey between them, her small legs swinging as she talked about her day at school. Malik listened, the sandwich untouched in his hand. He couldn't remember the last time someone had gone out of their way to make sure he had something to eat, something that wasn't handed out by a volunteer or a stranger at a shelter. Casey's stories were endless, her laughter infectious, and for a brief moment, Malik allowed himself to believe that he was part of this little world they were building. A world where he wasn't just a man on a bench, but someone who mattered. Suddenly, Casey turned to Vincent, her eyes wide with excitement. "Daddy, can we take Malik to the construction site? I want to see him work," she exclaimed, her voice filled with anticipation. Malik looked at Vincent, uncertain, but Vincent simply laughed, shaking his head. "Well, it's not exactly a playground, sweetheart," he said, "but maybe once Malik gets started, we can visit. How about that?" Casey nodded eagerly, her smile not dimming in the least. She turned back to Malik, her eyes bright. "You're going to do great, Malik," she said confidently. "Daddy says you're brave." Malik chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck, his eyes meeting Vincent's for a brief moment. "I'll give it my best shot, kiddo," he promised. He still felt that flicker of doubt, but somehow, with Casey's unwavering belief in him, it didn't seem as overwhelming. They spent the next hour at the park, Vincent sitting quietly, occasionally chiming in while Casey talked a mile a minute. Malik found himself relaxing, the usual tension that held his muscles taut beginning to ease. It was nice, being with them, feeling like he was part of something again. Eventually, Vincent glanced at his watch, a sigh escaping his lips. "All right, kiddo, we need to get going," he said, his voice tinged with reluctance. "I've got a meeting soon." Casey groaned, clearly not ready to leave. "But Daddy," she started, but Vincent shook his head. "No buts, Casey." "We'll see Malik again soon, okay?" Vincent said, his tone gentle but firm. Casey pouted, but she nodded, slipping off the bench. She gave Malik a quick hug, her small arms wrapping around his waist, and he froze for a moment, surprised by the gesture. Slowly he hugged her back, his heart swelling. "See you soon, Malik," she said, her voice filled with promise. Malik watched them leave, a smile on his face, the sandwich still in his hand. He waited until they had disappeared from sight before unwrapping it, taking a bite. The taste of peanut butter and jelly was simple, familiar, and it made something in his chest tighten, something that he hadn't felt in a long time. He finished the sandwich, his thoughts wandering. He had spent so long believing that his life was destined to be this way, alone, forgotten, lost in the shadows of the city. But now, with Vincent and Casey, it felt like maybe, just maybe, there was something more waiting for him, something worth fighting for. The day after, Malik decided to take the plunge. He picked up the business card that Vincent had given him, reading the address once more. He knew he couldn't keep waiting, couldn't keep holding back out of fear. If he was going to change his life, it had to start somewhere, and this was his chance. Malik arrived at the construction site early the next morning. The sun was barely up, the sky a muted gray, and he stood at the gate, his heart pounding in his chest. He hesitated, his feet rooted to the spot. This was it, his chance to prove himself, to take that step towards something better. But the fear lingered, gnawing at him. Before he could turn back, a voice called out from behind him. "Hey, you Malik?" Malik turned, startled. A man in his late 40s, wearing a hard hat and a reflective vest, approached him, his eyes squinting in curiosity. "Vincent said you'd be coming by," the man said, holding out his hand. "Name's Charlie. I'm the foreman here." Malik shook his hand, his voice catching in his throat. "Nice to meet you," he managed, his heart still racing. Yeah, Vincent told me I could stop by." Charlie nodded, giving Malik a once-over. "You ever worked construction before?" he asked, his tone blunt. Malik shook his head. "Not really," he admitted, "but I'm willing to learn." Charlie studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, we can use some extra hands around here. You follow directions, work hard, and we won't have a problem." He gave Malik a small grin. "Vincent vouched for you, so you've got a shot. Don't waste it." Malik felt a rush of gratitude, the words catching in his throat. He nodded, determination settling in his chest. "I won't," he promised. Charlie led him onto the site, showing him the ropes, the work that needed to be done. It was hard, physical labor, and Malik's muscles ached with every lift, every push. But he pushed through, the sweat dripping down his forehead, his heart pounding as he worked. It was the kind of work that made him feel alive, made him feel like he was doing something that mattered. By midday, Malik was exhausted, his body sore, but he felt a sense of pride that he hadn't felt in years. Charlie clapped him on the back, a grin on his face. "Not bad for your first day," he said. "Keep this up, and you'll fit in just fine." Malik smiled, his chest swelling with a sense of hope. Maybe he didn't have everything figured out yet. Maybe the path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving forward, like he was building something that mattered. As the day ended, Malik left the construction site, his steps heavy but his heart light. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be setbacks and challenges. But he was ready. He had a job, a purpose, and people who believed in him. And for Malik, that was more than enough to keep going. He walked back to the park, the sun setting in brilliant hues of orange and pink, and sat on his usual bench. He pulled out the bracelet Casey had given him, his fingers tracing the worn threads, a smile spreading across his face. "Maybe there's hope for me yet," Malik whispered, his voice carried away by the evening breeze. And for the first time in a long time, Malik believed it. The days turned into weeks, and Malik continued to work at Vincent's construction company. He threw himself into the work, the physical exertion grounding him, giving him a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. The men on the site gradually warmed to him, the skeptical glances giving way to nods of acknowledgement, and then to camaraderie. Malik didn't expect it, but he was finally beginning to feel like he belonged. Vincent, on the other hand, found himself in unfamiliar territory. As much as he had initially tried to maintain distance, his feelings toward Malik had shifted significantly since that day in the park. It wasn't that he suddenly considered Malik a close friend, far from it, but he found himself respecting the man. The dedication, the resilience, the way Malik interacted with Casey, always kind and attentive, these qualities gnawed at the edges of Vincent's preconceived notions, gradually wearing them away. One Friday afternoon, Vincent decided to swing by the construction site. The sky was overcast, a heavy gray blanket hinting at rain, and the air was thick with humidity. As Vincent parked his SUV near the site entrance, he caught sight of Malik carrying heavy planks across the lot. Malik moved with a steady determination, his face set in concentration, his muscles straining with effort. Vincent watched for a moment, a strange mix of admiration and concern bubbling in his chest. He hadn't come to see Malek work. There was a reason for his visit, one that made his stomach twist in knots. The past few weeks had been challenging for Vincent, balancing work, parenting Casey, and managing the business. He'd been considering a risky new development project, something that could either lift his company to new heights or bring it crashing down. It was a gamble, and Vincent wasn't sure if it was one he could afford to take. He stepped out of the car, the heavy scent of sawdust and freshly cut wood filling his lungs as he approached the site. Charlie, the foreman, waved him over. "Hey, boss," Charlie called, his voice booming. "Didn't think we'd see you out here today." Vincent gave a curt nod, his eyes scanning the site. "Thought I'd come by and check in. How's everything going?" Charlie smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Pretty good. The new guy's fitting in well. Malik's been working his tail off. Real hard worker, that one." Vincent's gaze drifted to Malik, who was now unloading bags of cement from the back of a truck. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, he's something else." Charlie chuckled, slapping Vincent on the shoulder. "You know, boss, not many people would take a chance on a guy like that. But it's working out. He's got a good heart. Can tell that much already." Vincent shifted, slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "Just trying to help where I can," he muttered, then added, "I need to talk to Malik for a second. You mind?" Charlie shook his head, a knowing smile on his face. "Go right ahead." Vincent walked across the lot, his footsteps crunching against the gravel, until he reached Malik. He cleared his throat, and Malik looked up, his face breaking into a smile when he saw Vincent. "Hey, Vincent," Malik greeted, setting down the bag of cement and wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Didn't expect to see you here today." Vincent shoved his hands into his pockets, his gaze shifting away for a moment before settling back on Malik. I need to talk to you about something. You got a minute?" Malik frowned, sensing the tension in Vincent's voice. "Sure," he said, wiping his hands on his pants. "What's up?" Vincent gestured toward a quieter corner of the site, and they walked over, the sounds of hammering and machinery fading into the background. Once they were alone, Vincent paused, taking a deep breath. "Listen, Malik, I'm not great at this kind of stuff," Vincent started, his voice low. "But I need to ask you for a favor." Malik raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "A favor?" he echoed. "From me?" Vincent nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground for a moment before meeting Malik's eyes again. "Yeah, it's about Casey." At the mention of Casey's name, Malik's expression softened. "Is she okay?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "She's fine," Vincent quickly assured him. "But there's this thing at her school, a parent-child event. And with my schedule, I can't make it. I tried to rearrange meetings, but it's just not working out." He paused, the words catching in his throat. "She asked if you could come. She wants you there." Malik blinked, taken aback. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He hadn't expected this, hadn't imagined that Casey would want him, of all people, to fill in for her father. Vincent continued, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "I know it's a lot to ask, and you're not obligated. But Casey's been talking about you nonstop. She looks up to you, Malik. And if you could do this for her, it would mean the world to her." Malik swallowed hard, emotion welling up in his chest. He thought of Casey, her bright smile, the way her eyes lit up whenever she saw him. The idea of being there for her, of standing in for Vincent, it filled him with a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. "I'll do it," Malik said, his voice steady. "I'd be honored to be there for Casey." Vincent's shoulders seemed to relax, a hint of relief washing over his face. He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you, Malik." "Really?" Malik smiled back, a warmth spreading through him that chased away the lingering shadows of doubt. He was starting to see that maybe, just maybe, he was capable of being someone that others could depend on, someone who mattered. The event took place 2 days later, a Saturday morning, at Casey's school. Malik had spent the entire previous evening worrying about it, unsure of what to wear, what to say, how to act. He hadn't stepped foot in a school in decades, and the thought of being around so many parents, people who had their lives together, was intimidating. But when the morning came, Malik stood in front of the mirror at the local shelter, wearing the nicest clothes he could piece together, a simple button-down shirt and slacks that had been donated. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. This was for Casey, and for her, he would face any fear. He arrived at the school early, waiting near the entrance, his hands shoved into his pockets. He felt out of place watching parents and children arrive, their laughter and chatter filling the air. He wondered if they could tell, if they could see that he didn't belong here. Then he saw her, Casey, running toward him, her face lit up with excitement. She wore a bright yellow dress, her hair tied back in a neat braid, and she waved at him, her smile infectious. "Malik," she called, her voice cutting through the noise. She reached him, wrapping her arms around his waist in a hug. "You came." Malik hugged her back, his heart swelling. "Of course I did, kiddo. Wouldn't miss it for the world." Casey beamed up at him, her eyes shining. She grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the school entrance. "Come on, I want to show you everything." The morning passed in a blur, games, activities, laughter. Casey introduced Malik to her classmates, proudly calling him her hero. And Malik felt something break open inside of him, a warmth that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He wasn't just a homeless man anymore. To Casey, he was a protector, a friend, someone she trusted. There was a moment near the end of the event when Malik found himself sitting at a small table surrounded by children, helping them build small birdhouses out of popsicle sticks. Casey sat beside him, her concentration fierce as she glued the pieces together. Malik glanced at her, a smile playing on his lips. "You're pretty good at this," he said, nudging her playfully. Casey giggled, her eyes never leaving her work. "That's because you're helping me," she replied, her voice full of conviction. Malik's smile widened, his heart feeling full to the point of bursting. He had spent so long believing that he was alone, that he didn't deserve the kindness or love that others seemed to find so easily. But here, with Casey, surrounded by her laughter and joy, he felt something shift, something profound. Maybe, he thought, there was a place for him in this world after all. When the event ended, Vincent arrived to pick Casey up. He approached Malik, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence between them, and then Vincent spoke, his voice quiet. "Thank you, Malik, for today. It meant a lot to Casey, and to me." Malik nodded, his throat tightening. "She's a special kid, Vincent. You're doing a good job with her." Vincent's eyes softened, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "I'm trying, and I think maybe we could both use a little help sometimes." There was a pause, a moment of understanding passing between them. Vincent held out his hand and Malik took it, their handshake firm, a silent agreement forming between them. As they parted ways, Casey waved at Malik from the car window, her smile wide, and Malik waved back, his heart light. He watched as they drove away, a sense of hope filling his chest. This was just the beginning. A turning point not only for Vincent, but for him as well. He had found something he hadn't realized he was searching for. A sense of belonging, a place where he mattered. And for the first time in a long time, Malik allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were finally changing for the better. The following weeks flew by, and Malik slowly began to settle into a rhythm at the construction site. Work was hard, but rewarding, and each day ended with a deep sense of satisfaction that he hadn't felt in a long time. He was still the quiet man on the periphery, keeping to himself for the most part. But things were changing. The workers who had once looked at him with suspicion now greeted him with nods of acknowledgement, some even offering smiles or words of encouragement. It was a small step, but for Malik, it was monumental. Casey, true to her word, never stayed away for too long. Once or twice a week, Vincent would bring her to visit the construction site, and she'd run straight to Malik, her face lighting up at the sight of him. It became a routine Malik looked forward to, those precious minutes spent with Casey, sharing stories or simply watching her chatter away, her excitement bubbling over. She had a way of bringing warmth into his life, her energy cutting through the chill of doubt that sometimes still crept in. On one particular Thursday afternoon, the site was buzzing with activity. The crew was working on the foundation of a new building, the air filled with the sharp sound of hammers, the whir of electric drills, and the occasional barked instruction from Charlie, the foreman. Malik was focused on his task, hauling a large wheelbarrow filled with gravel across the site, sweat dripping from his forehead under the mid-afternoon sun. As he unloaded the gravel, he looked up to see Casey's unmistakable figure running toward him. She was waving, her bright pink backpack bouncing on her shoulders, and Malik couldn't help but smile. "Hey, Malik," she called, her voice carrying over the noise of the site. Malik wiped his hands on his jeans and waved back. "Hey, Casey, what brings you here today?" Casey came to a stop in front of him, panting slightly. "Dad had to pick me up early from school. He said we could come see you before he went back to work." Vincent wasn't far behind, walking at a more leisurely pace, a small smile on his face as he watched his daughter. He nodded to Malik when he got closer. "She insisted," he said, by way of explanation, a hint of amusement in his tone. Malik chuckled, leaning down to ruffle Casey's hair. "Well, I'm glad she did." Casey grinned up at him, her eyes bright. "Malik, guess what? I got an award today. A kindness award for helping a new student in class." Malik's heart swelled with pride. He knelt down to her level, his eyes locking onto hers. "That's amazing, Casey. I knew you had a big heart. That kid is lucky to have you as a friend." Casey beamed, her cheeks flushing with happiness. "Thanks, Malik. I wanted to tell you first." Vincent watched the exchange, something softening in his gaze. He had seen his daughter happy before, but there was something different about the way she lit up around Malik. It was genuine, unguarded, and it made him realize just how much Malik meant to her. "Hey, Malik," Vincent said after a moment, drawing Malik's attention. "Do you have a minute to talk? There's something I've been meaning to ask you." Malik's brow furrowed, curiosity piqued. Sure. What's up?" Vincent glanced down at Casey, who was now busy examining the tools lying on a nearby workbench. He gestured for Malik to follow him a little distance away, out of earshot. Once they were alone, Vincent took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. "Listen, I've been thinking a lot about everything lately," he began, his gaze shifting to the ground before meeting Malik's eyes. "About you and Casey and this whole situation." Malik stayed silent, his heart pounding slightly. He wasn't sure where Vincent was going with this, but he could sense the seriousness in his tone. "I know we come from different worlds," Vincent continued, his voice a little strained, "and I know that trusting someone, especially in my position, doesn't come easy. But Casey, she sees something in you, something good, and I see it too now." He paused, his eyes searching Malik's face for a reaction. Malik swallowed, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. He had spent so long feeling like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong, and hearing those words from Vincent, a man who had every reason to keep his distance, hit him harder than he expected. "I guess what I'm trying to say," Vincent went on, a hint of vulnerability breaking through his usually composed demeanor, "is that I want to offer you something, an opportunity." Malik frowned slightly, confusion crossing his face. "An opportunity?" Vincent nodded. "I want you to consider moving into one of the apartments I manage. It's not much, just a small place, but it's clean, and it would be yours. A fresh start. You've more than earned it, with everything you've done for Casey and everything you're doing here at the site." Malik blinked, stunned into silence. For a long moment, he could only stare at Vincent, the offer echoing in his ears. An apartment, a place to call his own. It was more than he had dared to hope for, more than he had imagined possible. Vincent seemed to sense his hesitation, his expression softening. "You don't have to decide right away," he said, his tone gentle. "I know it's a lot to think about, but I want you to know that you're not alone, Malik, not anymore. You have people who care about you, who want to see you succeed." Malik's throat tightened, emotion welling up inside him. He had spent so long fighting to survive, never expecting anyone to offer him a hand, never expecting kindness without a catch. But here it was, a genuine offer, a chance at something better. He cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say, Vincent. I'm not used to people doing things like this for me. Vincent smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. You don't have to say anything right now. Just think about it. And know that the offer stands whenever you're ready. Malik nodded, his heart pounding. He watched as Vincent turned and walked back toward Casey, who looked up and waved at Malik, her smile as bright as ever. Malik waved back, a sense of hope blooming in his chest. That night, Malik lay on his cot at the shelter, staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing. Vincent's offer played over and over in his head, each word a beacon of hope, a glimpse of a future he had long thought was out of reach. A place of his own, a fresh start. The idea was both exhilarating and terrifying. He had spent so many years surviving on the streets, scraping by, that the thought of stability, of a home, felt almost unreal. Could he do it? Could he really start over? His thoughts drifted to Casey, the way her face lit up whenever she saw him, the way she had hugged him at the school event, calling him her hero. She believed in him, even when he struggled to believe in himself. And Vincent, despite their differences, despite the initial mistrust, had extended a hand, offering him a chance to build something better. Malik took a deep breath, his eyes closing. Maybe it was time to take that leap. Maybe it was time to trust that good things could happen, that he deserved them. The next day at the construction site, Malik approached Vincent during a break, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a mix of fear and determination, his hands trembling slightly as he walked over to where Vincent was talking with Charlie. "Hey, Vincent," Malik called, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his stomach. Vincent turned, a curious expression on his face. "Malik, what's up?" Malik took a deep breath, his gaze meeting Vincent's. "I've been thinking about your offer, and I'd like to take it, if it's still on the table." Vincent's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across his face before it was replaced by a smile, genuine and warm. He nodded, clapping a hand on Malik's shoulder. "Of course it's still on the table. I'm glad to hear it, Malik. Really." Charlie, who had been listening, grinned. "Looks like you're moving up in the world, Malik. You deserve it, man." Malik smiled, a sense of pride washing over him. "Thanks, Charlie. And thank you, Vincent. I don't know how to repay you." Vincent shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Malik. Just keep being who you are. That's more than enough." Malik nodded, emotion tightening his throat. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, he could build a life worth living. Later that evening, Vincent drove Malik to the apartment building. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, but it was clean and well-maintained, with a small courtyard out front. Vincent led Malik up the stairs to the second floor, stopping in front of a door marked 2B. "This is it," Vincent said, handing Malik a set of keys. "It's not much, but it's yours. I've taken care of the first few months' rent. You can pay me back when you're ready. No rush." Malik took the keys, his hands trembling. He looked at the door, then back at Vincent, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, Vincent. I don't know what to say." Vincent smiled, a warmth in his eyes that Malik had never seen before. "You don't have to say anything, Malik. Just welcome home." Malik swallowed hard, his heart swelling with emotion. He turned the key in the lock, pushing the door open. The apartment was small, just a single room with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but it was clean and bright, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, casting a golden glow across the floor. Malik stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat. He had a home, a place of his own. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, a belief that maybe, just maybe, things were finally starting to change for the better. Vincent watched from the doorway, a small smile on his face. "Take your time, Malik. Get settled in, and if you need anything at all, you know where to find me." Malik turned, his eyes meeting Vincent's. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "For everything." Vincent nodded, a hint of emotion in his eyes. "You're welcome, Malik. I'll see you soon." With that, Vincent turned and walked away, leaving Malik alone in his new apartment. Malik stood there for a moment, taking it all in, the quiet, the warmth, the sense of belonging. He walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Malik felt a sense of hope bloom in his chest. A new possibility, a new beginning, and for the first time in a long time, Malik allowed himself to believe that he was finally home. The first morning Malik woke up in his new apartment, he almost forgot where he was. The sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting warm golden streaks across the small room. Malik blinked his eyes open, taking in the unfamiliar space. The kitchenette in the corner, the small table by the window, the folded blanket on the old but sturdy couch he had slept on. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt strange to someone used to the background hum of the shelter, or the unpredictable noises of the streets. It was a good kind of quiet, though, a silence that spoke of safety rather than isolation. Malik took a deep breath, a smile tugging at his lips as he stretched, feeling the stiffness in his muscles. He stood up, rubbing a hand over his face as he walked over to the window. Opening it, he let the fresh morning air fill the room, his eyes scanning the street below. Cars were already making their way through the intersection, people walking briskly with coffee cups and work bags slung over their shoulders. The city was waking up, and for the first time in a long time, Malik felt like he was part of it, instead of just watching from the sidelines. The transition into his new life wasn't without its bumps, though. That first week, Malik found himself feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. He went to work at Vincent's construction company each day, coming home to the empty apartment each night. The crew had started to warm up to him. Charlie often gave him an approving nod at the end of the day, and a few of the guys even shared jokes with him during breaks. It was a gradual process, but Malik felt himself slowly being accepted, the invisible walls between him and the others beginning to come down, brick by brick. He still battled doubts, though. Those nagging thoughts that told him this was all temporary, that the other shoe was going to drop sooner or later. Every time he unlocked the door to his apartment, there was a small part of him that expected it to have vanished, like some kind of elaborate mirage. But it never did. Each night the warmth of the room welcomed him, and the keys were still there, solid and real, clinking in his pocket as he turned the lock. On the third day in his new place, there was a knock at his door. Malik, half asleep from a long day's work, frowned as he stood up from the couch. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door to find Casey standing there, her smile bright enough to light up the entire hallway. "Casey?" Malik said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Casey grinned, holding up a plastic bag in one hand. "Dad said we should bring you a housewarming gift. I picked it out myself." Malik blinked, touched. He stepped aside, gesturing for Casey to come in. "Well, come on in, kid. What have you got there?" Casey bounded into the room, her eyes wide as she took in the small but cozy space. She turned back to Malik, holding out the bag. Malik took it, glancing inside, and a smile spread across his face when he pulled out the contents. A bright green potted plant with thick round leaves. "It's a jade plant," Casey said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "I read that they're supposed to be good luck. Plus, they don't need too much water, so it should be easy to take care of." Malik chuckled, his chest warming with gratitude. He looked at Casey, her enthusiasm contagious. "Thank you, Casey. This means a lot to me." Casey beamed. "You're welcome. Now you'll have something alive in here with you." She paused, a mischievous grin crossing her face. "Besides, it's hard to mess up with a plant that's supposed to be really tough. Dad said it's kind of like you." Malik laughed, shaking his head. "Is that so? Well, I guess I'll have to live up to the plant's reputation then." Vincent, who had been standing by the door watching with a small smile, cleared his throat. "Casey insisted we stop by after school. Hope we're not intruding." Malik shook his head, his eyes softening as he looked at Vincent. "Not at all. I appreciate you coming by. It's nice to, have company." Vincent nodded, his gaze sweeping over the apartment, taking in the simple but well-kept space. "It looks like you're settling in," he said, his voice lacking the formality it had once carried. There was something more genuine now, something that hinted at mutual respect. "Yeah," Malik said, his voice soft. "It's starting to feel like home." Later that evening, after Vincent and Casey had left, Malik found himself staring at the jade plant, now sitting proudly on the small table by the window. It was such a simple thing, a gift that didn't cost much, but carried a meaning far beyond its price. It symbolized hope, growth, a new beginning. Malik reached out, brushing his fingers against the thick leaves, and felt a sense of connection to it. Two survivors, resilient and strong. Over the following weeks, Malik found himself falling into a new kind of rhythm, one that included more than just work and solitude. Vincent had made it clear that he was there if Malik needed anything. And Casey, well, Casey made sure Malik was never alone for too long. One Friday evening, just as Malik was finishing up at the construction site, Vincent approached him, a thoughtful look on his face. "Hey, Malik, got a minute?" Malik wiped the sweat from his forehead, turning to Vincent. "Sure, what's up?" Vincent shifted on his feet, as if considering his words. "Casey's been asking if you'd like to come over for dinner this weekend. I know it's short notice, but I figured I'd extend the invitation." Malik's eyes widened slightly. Dinner with Vincent and Casey? It felt personal, like a step into territory he hadn't quite expected. But the hopeful smile on Vincent's face, the thought of Casey's excitement, it all made the decision easy. "Yeah, I'd like that," Malik said, nodding. "I'd really like that." Vincent's expression brightened and he clapped Malik on the shoulder. "Great, we'll see you tomorrow evening then. Just bring yourself." The next evening, Malik found himself standing in front of Vincent's front door, his heart pounding in his chest. He had dressed in the best clothes he had, simple but clean, a collared shirt that Vincent had given him as a gift when he moved into the apartment. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately, Casey's face appearing with a wide grin. "Malik, you came." Malik smiled, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease at the sight of her. "Of course I did. You invited me, didn't you?" Casey grabbed his hand, pulling him inside. "Come on, Dad's just finishing up in the kitchen. We're having spaghetti. It's my favorite." Malik let himself be led inside, his eyes scanning the living room. It was warm and welcoming, filled with family photos and small decorations. It felt like the kind of home he'd always wanted, cozy, filled with laughter and warmth. He felt a pang in his chest, a longing that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Vincent emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. "Hey, Malik, glad you could make it." Malik nodded, smiling. "Thanks for having me, Vincent." Dinner was a relaxed affair, filled with laughter and stories. Casey talked a mile a minute, telling Malik about her school, her friends, and everything in between. Vincent chimed in here and there, his demeanor softer than Malik had ever seen. It felt normal, like a real family dinner. Malik found himself smiling, laughing, feeling the weight on his shoulders lift. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Casey insisted on playing a board game, and they all sat around the coffee table, rolling dice and moving pieces across the board. Malik had never played this particular game before, and he found himself struggling at first, but Casey's laughter and Vincent's occasional teasing made it all worthwhile. As the evening drew to a close, Vincent walked Malik to the door, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, Malik," he said, his voice low enough that Casey, now in the other room, couldn't hear, "I never thought I'd be doing something like this, having someone like you over for dinner, but I'm glad I did." Malik looked at Vincent, his throat tightening. He knew what Vincent meant, that despite their differences, despite everything that had once separated them, they had found a way to bridge the gap. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was more than enough for Malik. "I'm glad too, Vincent," Malik said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. For everything." Vincent nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "This isn't charity, Malik. You're part of our lives now, and that means something." Malik swallowed, his eyes glistening. I don't know if I deserve all this." Vincent shook his head. "You do. You deserve more than you know. And you're going to get there, one step at a time." Malik left that evening with a sense of warmth he hadn't felt in years. He walked back to his apartment, the cool night air brushing against his face, and for once he felt a sense of peace. He was taking steps, small, shaky steps, but they were his, leading him into a new life, a better life. As he reached his building and climbed the stairs to his apartment, Malik paused at his door, glancing back at the hallway behind him. This place, this new beginning, it wasn't just a roof over his head. It was a chance to belong, to be part of something more. And for the first time, he allowed himself to truly believe in it. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, the warmth of the apartment wrapping around him. The jade plant sat by the window, its leaves glistening in the moonlight, and Malik smiled. He walked over, touching one of the leaves gently, feeling its resilience. He wasn't alone anymore. He had people who cared about him, people who believed in him, and maybe, just maybe, he could start believing in himself too. Malik's newfound confidence wavered as the weeks went on. The steady routine of work had become a comfort, but the past had a way of creeping in, whispering doubts that he couldn't ignore. He knew how to lift a beam, how to mix cement, but trusting that he deserved to be here, really believing it, was another challenge entirely. One gray morning, as he arrived at the construction site, Malik noticed an unfamiliar figure leaning against the chain-link fence. The man was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his clothes worn and dirty. Malik's steps faltered as recognition hit him like a punch to the gut. It was Louis, an old friend from his days on the street. Louis's face lit up when he saw Malik, and he pushed away from the fence, stumbling toward him. "Malik! Hey, man! I've been looking for you!" he called, his voice rough from years of cigarettes and hardship. Malik hesitated, glancing around. The crew was already gathering near the site's entrance, preparing for the day. He could feel their eyes on him, watching this encounter unfold. Paul especially stood a few feet away, his brow furrowed in concern. "Louis, what are you doing here?" Malik asked, keeping his voice low. He wanted to keep this part of his past separate from the life he was trying to build. Louis gave a crooked grin, revealing a missing tooth. "Heard you got yourself a job, a steady gig. I thought maybe you could help a brother out, you know?" Malik swallowed, his heart sinking. He knew what Louis wanted. It wasn't just help. It was money. It was a ticket to the same dark place Malik had fought so hard to escape. He looked at his old friend, remembering the cold nights they'd spent huddled under bridges, sharing stories, dreams, and the small warmth of a shared meal. "I can't, Louis," Malik said, shaking his head. "I'm trying to stay on track. You know that." Louis's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing. "Come on, man. Don't turn your back on me now. We've been through hell together." Malik felt a knot tightening in his chest. He didn't want to abandon Louis, but he couldn't risk everything he had worked for. Not now. Not when he finally had something worth holding on to. "Maybe I can help you get to a shelter," Malik offered, his voice soft but firm. "There's a place downtown. They might have a bed open tonight." Louis scoffed, his face darkening. "A shelter? I thought you were better than that, Malik. Thought you'd remember where you came from." With a final glare, Louis turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched in defeat. Malik watched him go, the weight of guilt pressing heavily on his chest. He stood there for a moment, lost in thought, until he heard Paul's voice behind him. "You all right, Malik?" Paul asked, his tone unusually gentle. Malik turned, startled to see the concern in Paul's eyes. He nodded, though his voice sounded hollow in his own ears. "Yeah, just someone I used to know." Paul studied him for a long moment before nodding. "We've all got people like that in our past. Just remember, you're here now. You earned this." The words were simple, but they carried an unexpected kindness that cut through Malik's doubts. He gave Paul a small, grateful smile, feeling a flicker of strength reignite inside him. "Thanks, Paul." That evening, after work, Malik returned to his small apartment, his mind still heavy with thoughts of Louis. He sat by the window, staring out at the darkening sky. The bracelet Casey had given him was wrapped around his wrist, the small beads warm against his skin. He ran his fingers over them, feeling the smooth surface. He remembered Casey's smile, her innocent questions, and the way she looked at him, with trust, with hope. It was that memory that anchored him, that reminded him why he was doing this. He couldn't let his past define him. Not anymore. Malik reached for the small jade plant he kept on the windowsill, carefully turning it so that each leaf caught the fading sunlight. The plant had grown since he'd first brought it here, its roots settling into the soil, its leaves unfurling in slow, steady determination. Just like him, he closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He'd come too far to let the ghosts of his past pull him back. He had people who believed in him now. He had a job, a purpose, and, most importantly, he had a future, one he was finally beginning to believe in. The following day, Malik arrived at the site early, his resolve stronger than before. He greeted his co-workers with a nod, his steps purposeful. Paul gave him a thumbs up, and Charlie, ever the jokester, slapped him on the back. The camaraderie among the crew was something Malik cherished, something he was slowly allowing himself to trust. The day's task was to lift a steel beam into place, a job that required coordination and strength. Malik was assigned to work the ropes alongside Eric, who had warmed up to him after the scaffolding incident. They worked in tandem, Malik's muscles straining as he pulled, the beam inching higher with each coordinated tug. "Easy, Malik," Eric called out, his voice laced with focus. "We got this." Malik nodded, sweat beading on his forehead. He kept his eyes on the beam, adjusting his grip as they brought it into position. He could feel the eyes of his co-workers on him, the unspoken support that came with being part of a team. It was a feeling he had missed, a sense of belonging that had eluded him for so long. Finally, with a final heave, the beam settled into place. Malik let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a smile breaking across his face. The crew cheered, their voices echoing across the site. Paul clapped Malik on the shoulder, his grin genuine. "Good job, Malik. You're a natural," Paul said, his eyes meeting Malik's. Malik nodded, the warmth of pride blooming in his chest. It wasn't just about the work. It was about proving to himself that he could do this, that he could be someone worth believing in. As the day drew to a close, Vincent arrived at the site, Casey in tow. She ran toward Malik, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Malik," she called, her small arms wrapping around his waist in a tight hug. Vincent approached, a smile on his face. "Heard you had a good day today," he said, his voice filled with pride. Malik looked at Casey, then at Vincent, his heart swelling. "Yeah," he replied, his voice steady. "It was a good day." Vincent nodded, his eyes meeting Malik's. "You deserve it, Malik. You really do." Malik looked down at Casey, her smile so pure and full of hope. In that moment, Malik knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The doubts that had haunted him, the shadows of his past, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was here, now. The people who believed in him, the strength he had found within himself, and the future he was finally ready to embrace. The days started to blur together as Malik settled into his new life. The steady rhythm of work, the camaraderie with the construction crew, and the comforting presence of Casey and Vincent became the cornerstones of his existence. He found a sense of purpose in every task, from mixing cement to helping his co-workers hoist beams into place. There was pride in his hands, hands that had once begged for change, now contributing to something tangible, something that would stand tall and shelter others. One morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, bathing the construction site in soft light, Malik stood silently, staring at the skeletal structure they were building. He admired how each piece, on its own, seemed insignificant, but when combined, created something strong and enduring. In a way, it mirrored his own life, broken parts slowly coming together to form something meaningful. "Hey, daydreamer!" Paul's voice cut through the morning stillness, jolting Malik from his thoughts. "You going to help us put this thing up, or are you just going to stand there admiring it?" Malik turned to see Paul grinning at him, a playful glint in his eyes. Malik chuckled, the sound genuine, unforced. "On it, Paul," he called back, grabbing his gloves and stepping into the rhythm of the day. As the morning wore on, Malik felt a growing sense of fulfillment. He was becoming more confident in his abilities, not just as a worker, but as someone people could depend on. He was no longer just a man drifting through life. He was a part of something greater, contributing to a team that trusted him. By midday, Vincent arrived at the site with Casey. She jumped out of the car, her eyes lighting up when she spotted Malik. "Malik!" she shouted, running toward him. Malik bent down, catching her in a hug. "Hey, kiddo! What are you doing here?" he asked, smiling. "Daddy had some paperwork to drop off, and I begged him to let me come see you," Casey replied, beaming. "Can I stay for lunch?" Malik glanced at Vincent, who had made his way over, a fond look on his face as he watched them. Vincent gave a slight nod, and Malik's smile widened. "Of course you can, Casey. We can even share some of my sandwich, if you're interested in a real gourmet construction worker meal," Malik teased. Casey laughed, her giggles a sound that warmed Malik's heart. They sat down on a stack of wooden pallets, Casey swinging her legs as Malik unwrapped his lunch. Paul and a few other co-workers joined them, making small talk and laughing at Casey's jokes. For a moment, it felt like a family picnic. Simple, comforting, and exactly what Malik had always wanted. Vincent, standing a few feet away, watched with a thoughtful expression. He had been skeptical of Malik at first, wary of the man who had stepped into his daughter's life under such dramatic circumstances. But over time, Vincent had seen the depth of Malik's character, his integrity, his kindness, and his willingness to fight for a better life. Slowly, the walls Vincent had built around his heart began to crumble. "Malik," Vincent called, his voice breaking through the laughter. Malik looked up, his eyes meeting Vincent's. "Can we talk for a second?" Malik's heart skipped a beat, worry flashing across his face for just a moment. He patted Casey on the shoulder and stood, walking over to Vincent. "What's up?" Malik asked, trying to read Vincent's expression. Vincent hesitated, then spoke, his voice unusually soft. "I know this might come out of nowhere, but I wanted to thank you. Not just for what you did for Casey that day, but for everything since. You've made a difference in her life, and in mine." Malik blinked, taken aback. He swallowed, unsure how to respond. I don't know what to say, Vincent. You and Casey have done more for me than I could ever repay." Vincent shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You don't owe us anything, Malik. If anything, I owe you. For giving Casey a role model, for showing her what real courage looks like." The words caught Malik off guard, emotion rising in his chest. No one had ever spoken to him like that before, and it felt like a balm on wounds he hadn't even realized were still open. Vincent cleared his throat, the moment heavy with unspoken emotions. "I was thinking, maybe we could make things a bit more official. I could use someone with your dedication permanently in the company. Not just as a worker, but as part of the core team. You'd have a proper salary, benefits, a future." Malik stared at Vincent, the weight of his words sinking in. This was more than just an offer of work. This was a chance to rebuild his life in a way he had thought was impossible. "Are you serious?" Malik finally asked, his voice cracking slightly. Vincent nodded. "I am. You deserve this, Malik. You've earned it." Malik felt his eyes stinging, tears threatening to spill over. He took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "Thank you, Vincent. I don't know how to thank you enough." Vincent clapped a hand on Malik's shoulder. "Just keep being you. That's all the thanks I need." The next few weeks flew by in a blur of hard work and new beginnings. Malik found himself taking on more responsibility, overseeing tasks and helping coordinate the team. His co-workers respected him, not just for his work ethic, but for his unwavering determination and humility. For the first time in years, Malik felt truly valued, not just for what he could do, but for who he was. One afternoon, Vincent invited Malik over for dinner. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Malik dressed in his best clothes, an old but clean shirt, a pair of jeans that Casey had insisted looked cool. As he approached Vincent's house, nerves fluttered in his stomach. The door swung open before he could knock, Casey's bright smile greeting him. "Malik, you're here. Come in," she exclaimed, grabbing his hand and pulling him inside. The house was warm, filled with the comforting scent of a home-cooked meal. Vincent stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot, a relaxed smile on his face. "Make yourself at home, Malik," he called out. Dinner was a lively affair. Casey filled the room with her laughter, her stories, and her joy. Vincent and Malik shared stories of their workday, the conversation easy and natural. It felt like a glimpse into a life Malik had always dreamed of, but never thought he'd have, a family, a place where he belonged. After dinner, they sat in the living room. Casey curled up beside Malik as they watched a movie. She had insisted on sitting next to him, her head resting on his arm as her eyes grew heavy. Vincent watched them from the other side of the room, his heart full. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected a man like Malik to come into their lives and change everything. But he was grateful. Grateful for the strength Malik had shown, for the love he had given his daughter, for the hope he had brought into their home. As the night drew to a close, Malik stood at the door, Casey still half asleep, her arms wrapped around his waist in a hug. "You'll come back, right?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. Malik knelt, looking into her drowsy eyes. "Of course, Casey. I'll always be here when you need me." She smiled, her eyes closing as she hugged him tightly. "Good, because you're part of our family now." The words hit Malik's heart like a gentle wave, washing over him and filling him with warmth. He looked up at Vincent, who nodded, a silent affirmation of Casey's words. "Thank you," Malik whispered, his voice barely audible. Vincent smiled, a deep, genuine smile. "No, Malik, thank you for being exactly who you are." Malik stepped out into the cool night, the bracelet Casey had given him warm against his skin. He looked up at the stars, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He was building something new, not just a building, not just a job, but a life filled with hope, with purpose, and, most importantly, with love. And as he walked down the quiet street, Malik knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning of his journey, a journey where he would continue to build, not just for himself, but for the people who had given him a second chance, a journey toward a future he had never dared to imagine. But now it was finally within reach. Malik laughed, letting himself be led around the schoolyard. They played games, laughed at silly faces in the photo booth, and shared a stick of bright blue cotton candy. Everywhere they went, Malik noticed the warmth in the smiles of the other parents, and the acceptance in the way they welcomed him into their small world. For the first time in a long time, Malik felt like he belonged. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the family day event began to wind down. Malik and Casey found themselves sitting on a bench, watching as the other families slowly packed up and headed home. Casey leaned her head against Malik's arm, her eyes half closed from exhaustion. "Thank you for coming today, Malik," she said softly. "It was the best day ever." Malik smiled, his heart swelling with affection. "The best day ever, huh?" he teased gently. "Even better than when we went to that carnival last month?" Casey giggled, nodding. "Yup, because today everyone got to meet you, and now they know how amazing you are, just like I do." Malik swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. He looked down at the little girl beside him, her eyes filled with so much trust and love, and he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Gratitude for Casey, for Vincent, for the second chance he had been given. Gratitude for the life he was slowly rebuilding, one day at a time. "I'm the lucky one, Casey," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You've given me more than you could ever know." Casey smiled sleepily, her eyes closing, as she snuggled closer to him. Malik wrapped an arm around her, holding her close as he watched the last of the families leave the schoolyard. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the moment wash over him. A little while later, Vincent approached, having been chatting with one of the other parents. He smiled at the sight of Malik and Casey on the bench, his daughter fast asleep, her head resting on Malik's shoulder. "You two look comfortable," Vincent said softly, not wanting to wake Casey. Malik opened his eyes, smiling at Vincent. "She had a big day," he said, his voice filled with warmth. Vincent nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at his daughter. "Thank you for coming, Malik. It means a lot to her. And to me," he added, his voice sincere. Malik shook his head. "No need to thank me, Vincent. She's family, and family shows up for each other." Vincent's eyes met Malik's, a silent understanding passing between them. He nodded slowly, a smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, they do." He reached out, gently lifting Casey into his arms. She stirred, mumbling something incoherent as she nestled against her father's chest. Vincent looked at Malik, his expression earnest. "Come by for dinner tomorrow night. No special occasion, just dinner. I know Casey would love it, and so would I." Malik felt a warmth spread through his chest, a sense of belonging that he had longed for his entire life. He nodded, his smile reaching his eyes. "I'd love that," he said softly. Vincent gave him a small nod, turning to head toward the car. Malik watched them for a moment, his heart full as he took in the sight of the man and his daughter, walking together into the fading light. Malik lingered in the schoolyard for a few minutes, his gaze drifting to the sky. The stars were beginning to peek out, and he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the small bracelet Casey had given him the day they met. It was worn, the colors faded, but it still held so much meaning. He slipped it back onto his wrist, the feel of it grounding him in the present moment. He had come a long way from the park bench where this journey had started. He had faced fears, battled doubts, and taken risks he never thought he'd have the courage to take. And now, here he was, part of a family, surrounded by people who cared for him, building a future that was brighter than anything he had ever dared to dream. Malik stood up, slipping his hands into his pockets as he began to walk away from the schoolyard. There was still work to be done, challenges to face, and days that wouldn't always be easy. But for the first time, he was ready for whatever came next. Because he wasn't alone anymore. He had Casey, Vincent, and a new purpose that gave his life meaning. And as he walked into the night, Malik knew that this was not the end of his story. It was just the beginning of something beautiful, a future built on hope, love, and the promise of new beginnings.